Wolves in sheep's clothing have pulled the wool over our eyes. For almost 500 years, the masses have been thoroughly deceived by a cosmic fairy tale of astronomical proportions. We have been taught a falsehood so gigantic and diabolical that it has blinded us from our own experience and common sense, from seeing the world and the universe as they truly are. Through pseudoscience books and programs, mass media and public education, universities and government propaganda, the world has been systematically brainwashed, slowly indoctrinated over centuries into the unquestioning belief of the greatest lie of all time. David Wardlaw Scott said, "Children are taught in their geography books, when too young to apprehend aright the meaning of such things, that the world is a great globe revolving around the sun, and the story is repeated continuously year by year till they reach maturity, at which time they generally become so absorbed in other matters as to be indifferent as to whether the teaching be true or not, and, as they hear of nobody contradicting it, they presume that it must be the correct thing, if not to believe, at least to receive it as a fact. They thus tacitly give their assent to a theory which, if it had first been presented to them at what are called years of discretion, they would at once have rejected. The consequences of evil teaching, whether in religion or in science, are far more disastrous than is generally supposed, especially in a luxurious, laissez-faire age like our own. The intellect becomes weakened, and the conscience seared. For 500 years an elite cabal of sun-worshippers has propagated this nihilistic, atheistic cosmology and cosmogony, unquestioningly believed by the vast majority of the world. We have been taught, contrary to all common sense and experience, that the seemingly motionless, flat earth beneath our feet is actually a massive, moving ball spinning through space at over 1,000 miles per hour, wobbling and tilted 23.5 degrees on its vertical axis, while orbiting the sun at a blinding 67,000 miles per hour, in concert with the entire solar system, spiraling 500,000 miles per hour around the Milky Way, and careening across the expanding universe away from the Big Bang at an incredible 670 million miles per hour, but that you can feel and experience none of it. We have been taught that a mysterious force called gravity, a magical magnetism responsible for keeping everything from falling or flying off the spinning ball Earth, is just strong enough to hold people, oceans, and the atmosphere tightly to the surface, but just weak enough to allow bugs, birds, and planes to take off with ease." David Wardlaw Scott wrote, "I remember being taught when a boy that the earth was a great ball revolving at a very rapid rate around the sun, and when I expressed to my teacher my fears that the waters of the oceans would tumble off, I was told that they were prevented from doing so by Newton's great law of gravitation, which kept everything in its proper place. I presume that my countenance must have shown some signs of incredulity, for my teacher immediately added, 'I can show you a direct proof of this. A man can whirl around his head a pail filled with water without its being spilt, and so, in like manner, can the oceans be carried round the sun without losing a drop.' As this illustration was evidently intended to settle the matter, I then said no more upon the subject. Had such been proposed to me afterwards as a man, I would have answered somewhat as follows: 'Sir, I beg to say that the illustration you have given of a man whirling a pail of water round his head, and the oceans revolving round the sun, does not in any degree confirm your argument, because the water in the two cases is placed under entirely different circumstances, but, to be of any value, the conditions in each case must be the same, which here they are not. The pail is a hollow vessel, which holds the water inside it, whereas, according to your teaching, the earth is a ball, with a continuous curvature outside, which, in agreement with the laws of nature, could not retain any water. We have been taught that the ball Earth spins at a constant velocity, perfectly dragging the atmosphere along so we cannot feel the slightest bit of motion, perturbation, wind, or air resistance. They say we cannot feel any of this motion because the magical velcro of gravity pulls the atmosphere precisely along, and we cannot measure any of this motion because the stars are so incredibly far away that over 100 million miles of supposed annual orbit around the Sun amounts to not a single inch of relative parallax change. How convenient. We have been taught that the apparent orbit of the Sun, planets, and stars, but not the Moon, around the Earth are all optical illusions, that it is, in fact, the Earth beneath our feet which moves, and our eyes that deceive us. Special exception is made for the Moon, however, which is said to revolve around the Earth just as it appears. Since we only ever see one side of the Moon, we have been taught this is because the Moon's supposed 10.3 mile per hour west to east rotation, combined with its 2,288 mile per hour orbit of Earth, just happens to be the exact motion and speed necessary to perfectly cancel out the Earth's supposed 1,000 mile per hour east to west rotation and 67,000 mile per hour orbit of the Sun, thereby creating the perpetual dark side of the Moon illusion. Oh really? Though the Sun and Moon appear to be relatively small, equal-sized bodies revolving around a stationary Earth, we have been taught that this too is an optical illusion, and they are in fact thousands of miles divergent in diameter. They say the Sun is actually a whopping 865,374 miles across, 109 times wider than the Earth, and, contrary to all experience, experiments, and common sense, that we revolve around it. They say the Moon is 2,159 miles across, a quarter the size of the Earth, and why they appear the same size is because the Moon is only 238,000 miles away, while the Sun is an unfathomable 93 million miles away from the Earth, and these just happen to be the exact diameters and distances necessary for a viewer from Earth to falsely perceive them as being the same size. You don't say. Lactantius, in his On the False Wisdom of the Philosophers, wrote, "A sphere where people on the other side live with their feet above their heads, where rain, snow, and hail fall upwards, where trees and crops grow upside down, and the sky is lower than the ground. The ancient wonder of the hanging gardens of Babylon dwindle into nothing in comparison to the fields, seas, towns, and mountains that pagan philosophers believe to be hanging from the earth without support." David Wardlaw Scott wrote, "I confess that I cannot imagine how any human being, in his proper senses, can believe that the Sun is stationary when, with his own eyes, he sees it revolving around the heavens, nor how he can believe that the earth on which he stands is whirling with the speed of lightning around the Sun when he feels not the slightest motion." We have been taught that those tiny pinpricks of light in the night sky known as planets or wandering stars are actually physical, globular, Earth-like habitations millions of miles away. We have even been shown supposed video footage of the one called Mars. We have been taught that the tiny pinpricks of light in the sky known as the fixed stars are actually distant suns trillions of miles away, each complete with their own solar systems, orbiting moons, and Earth-like planets which potentially harbor alien life. We have been taught that the Moon has no light of its own, but is merely a reflector of the Sun's light, that some masons from NASA actually walked on the Moon, that some other masons from NASA sent rovers to Mars, that satellites and space stations are incessantly spinning in suspended animation above the Earth, that Hubble telescopes are taking snapshots of distant planets, galaxies, stars, quasars, black holes, wormholes, and other fantastic celestial phenomena. We have been taught that our ignorant ancient ancestors for millennia falsely believed the Earth to be the flat, immovable center of the universe, but thanks to modern science and its Masonic prophets like Copernicus, Newton, Galileo, Collins, Aldrin, and Armstrong, we now believe the world to be a giant whirling sea-Earth globe careening through infinite space. Thomas Winship wrote, Modern astronomical teaching affirms that the world we live on is a globe which rotates, revolves, and spins away in space at brain-reeling rates of speed, that the sun is 1.5 million times the volume of the Earth globe and nearly 100 million miles distant from it, that the moon is about a quarter the size of the Earth, that it receives all its light from the sun, and is thus only a reflector and not a giver of light, that it attracts the body of the Earth and thus causes the tides, that the stars are worlds and suns, some of them equal in importance to our own sun himself, and others vastly his superior, that these worlds inhabited by sentient beings are without numbers and occupy space boundless in extent and illimitable in duration, the whole of these interlaced bodies being subject to and supported by universal gravitation, the foundation and father of the whole fabric. To fanciful minds and theoretical speculators, the so-called science of modern astronomy furnishes a field unsurpassed in any science for the unrestrained license of the imagination, and the building up of a complicated conjuration of absurdities, such as to overawe the simpleton and make him gape with wonder, to deceive even those who truly believe their assumptions to be facts. We have been taught that science books like Newton's Principia Mathematica, which propound the spherical heliocentric myth, are the bearers of truth, while backwater religious books like the Bible, which propound a flat geocentric Earth, are merely outdated myths. We have been taught that the universe was unintelligently designed and randomly created in a cosmic coincidence of nothing inexplicably becoming everything. We have been taught that through millions upon millions of years of accidental evolution and happenstance, the Big Bang universe began manifesting suns, moons, planets, then water, then somehow out of dead, inert elements, single-celled conscious organisms came to life, grew and multiplied and mutated into larger, different organisms, which continued to grow, multiply, and mutate, gaining diversity and complexity, and losing credibility, to the point where amphibians crawled up on land, replaced gills with lungs, started breathing air, maturated into mammals, became bipedal, grew opposable thumbs, evolved into monkeys. Then in one final fluke adaptation, a hybrid monkey man was made, and the rest is human history. Thomas Winship wrote, "Put together all the imaginary exploits in the air specially written to interest the young, add to this all the wonderful adventures of airships recorded in The Daughter of the Revolution, and tack on to this all the wild and impossible things found in current libraries of fiction, and I venture to say that the grand total will record nothing so utterly impossible or so supremely ridiculous as this modern scientific delusion of a globe spinning away in space in several different directions at the same time at rates of speed which no man is able to grasp, with the inhabitants, some hanging heads down and others at various angles to suit the inclination. Write down all the swindles that ever were perpetrated, name all the hoaxes you ever heard or read about, include all of the impostures and bubbles ever exposed, make a list of all the snares that popular credulity could ever be exposed to, and you will fail in getting within sight or hearing of an imposture so gross, a hoax so ingenious, or a bubble of such gigantic proportions as has been perpetrated and forced upon unthinking multitudes in the name of science, and as proved incontrovertible fact by the expounders of modern astronomy. Again and again have their theories been combated and exposed, but as often have the majority who did not think for themselves accepted the popular thing. We have been taught that the height of stupidity and naivety was when our ignorant ancestors believed the earth to be flat, and that if any man somehow still thinks the earth to be the immovable center of the universe, that they must be the most primitive kind of ignoramus. Nowadays the label flat earther has become literally synonymous with moron, and is a common cliché derogatory term for insulting someone's intelligence. Upon seeing a book titled The Flat Earth Conspiracy, your ingrained instinct was likely to laugh, mock the messenger, and deny the very possibility. Marshall Hall said, "What strikes you as being some thoughts that people would have if, in the short space of a few weeks, the universally held conviction that the earth rotates on an axis daily and orbits the sun annually were exposed as an unscientific deception? Keep in mind that a rotating, orbiting Earth is not counted as a mere hypothesis or even a theory anywhere in the world today. Oh no! Rather, this concept is an unquestioned truth, an established fact in all books and other media everywhere, church media included. Copernicanism, in short, is a concept that is protected in a bunker under a 50-foot thick ceiling of solid scientific concrete. It is meant to be impregnable. It is a concept that has become ensconced in men's minds as the indestructible cornerstone of enlightened modern man's knowledge. Virtually all people everywhere have been taught to believe, and do believe, that this concept is based on objective science and dispassionate secular reasoning. B. Chasbro wrote, 99 people out of 100 would give the same answer to the interrogation, and that same answer would be to the effect that the Earth is a globe which revolves around the sun. The 99 who makes this reply would do it because they know it to be the case. How do they know it? Let this question be put to them, and they will bestow upon you a withering smile of pity at what they conceive to be an imbecility of mind on your part, and answer you in something like the following style. It has always been so. We learnt it at school. Clever men say so, and look how astronomers can foretell eclipses, and then lose their temper at the very idea of the globular theory being incorrect, and a haughty, there can be no doubt about it, will close all they have to say on the subject. Now if the ears of these 99 could only be gained, they would be shown, in an irresistible manner, that the philosophy which would speak of a round and revolving world is a false philosophy. It is part of the natural physics of water and other fluids to always find their level and remain flat. If disturbed in any way, motion ensues until the flat level is resumed. If dammed up, then released, the nature of all liquids is to quickly flood outwards, taking the easiest course towards finding its new level. From W. T. Lynn's First Principles of Natural Philosophy, the upper surface of a fluid at rest is a horizontal plane, because if a part of the surface were higher than the rest, those parts of the fluid which were under it would exert a greater pressure upon the surrounding parts than they receive from them, so that motion would take place amongst the particles and continue until there were none at a higher level than the rest, that is, until the upper surface of the whole mass of fluid became a horizontal plane. If the Earth is an extended flat plane, then this fundamental physical property of fluids finding and remaining level is consistent with experience and common sense. If, however, the Earth is a giant sphere tilted on its vertical axis, spinning through never-ending space, then it follows that truly flat, consistently level surfaces do not exist here. Moreover, if the Earth is spherical, then it follows that the surface of all Earth's water, including the massive oceans, must maintain a certain degree of convexity. But this is contrary to the fundamental physical nature of water to always be and remain level. From William Thomas Wiseman's The Earth an Irregular Plane. The surface of all water, when not agitated by natural causes, such as winds, tides, earthquakes, etc., is perfectly level. The sense of sight proves this to every unprejudiced and reasonable mind. Can any so-called scientist, who teaches that the Earth is a whirling globe, take a heap of liquid water, whirl it around, and so make rotundity? He cannot. Therefore it is utterly impossible to prove that an ocean is a whirling rotund section of a globular Earth, rushing through space at the lying given rate of false philosophers. If we were living on a whirling ball Earth, every pond, lake, marsh, canal, and other large body of standing water, each part would have to comprise a slight arc or semicircle curveting downwards from the central summit. For example, if the ball Earth were 25,000 miles in circumference, as NASA and modern astronomers say, then spherical trigonometry dictates the surface of all standing water must curve downwards an easily measurable 8 inches per mile, multiplied by the square of the distance. This means along a 6-mile channel of standing water, the Earth would dip 6 feet on either end from the central peak. To the benefit of true science, and to the detriment of modern astronomy's pseudoscience, such an experiment can and has been tested. In Cambridge, England, there is a 20-mile canal called the Old Bedford, which passes in a straight line through the fenlands known as the Bedford Level. The water has no interruption from locks or water gates of any kind, and remains stationary, making it perfectly suitable for determining whether any amount of convexity or curvature actually exists. In the latter part of the 19th century, Dr. Samuel Rowbotham, a famous flat-earther and author of the fine book Earth, Not a Globe, an experimental inquiry into the true figure of the Earth, proving it a plane without axial or orbital motion, and the only material world in the universe, traveled to the Bedford Level and performed a series of experiments to determine whether the surface of standing water is flat or convex. Samuel Rowbotham wrote, "A boat with a flagstaff, the top of the flag 5 feet above the surface of the water, was directed to sail from a place called Welch's Dam, a well-known ferry passage, to another called Welney Bridge. These 2 points are 6 statute miles apart. The author, with a good telescope, went into the water, and with the eye about 8 inches above the surface, observed the receding boat during the whole period required to sail to Welney Bridge. The flag and the boat were distinctly visible throughout the whole distance. There could be no mistake as to the distance passed over, as the man in charge of the boat had instructions to lift one of his oars to the top of the arch the moment he reached the bridge. The experiment commenced about 3 o'clock in the afternoon of a summer's day, and the sun was shining brightly and nearly behind or against the boat during the whole of its passage. Every necessary condition had been fulfilled, and the result was to the last degree definite and satisfactory. The conclusion was unavoidable, that the surface of the water for a length of 6 miles did not to any appreciable extent decline or curvate downwards from the line of sight. But if the earth is a globe, the surface of the 6 miles length of water would have been 6 feet higher in the center than at the 2 extremities. From this experiment it follows that the surface of standing water is not convex, and therefore that the earth is not a globe. On the contrary, this simple experiment is all sufficient to prove that the surface of the water is parallel to the line of sight, and is therefore horizontal, and that the earth cannot be other than a plane. In a second experiment, Dr. Rowbotham placed 7 flags along the edge of the water, each 1 mile distant from the next, with their tops positioned 5 feet above the surface. Near the last one he also positioned a longer 8-foot staff bearing a 3-foot flag, so that its bottom aligned precisely with the tops of the other flags. He then mounted a telescope at a height of 5 feet behind the first flag and took his observations. If the earth was a globe of 25,000 miles, each successive flag would have to decline a definite and determined amount below the last. The first and second flags simply established the line of sight. The third flag should then fall 8 inches below the second, the fourth flag 32 inches below, the fifth 6 feet, the sixth 10 feet 8 inches, and the seventh flag should be a clear 16 feet 8 inches below the line of sight. Even if the earth was a globe of 100,000 miles, an amount of easily measurable curvature should and would still be evident in this experiment. But the reality is not flags all lined up perfectly as consistent with a flat plane. Dr. Rowbotham wrote, "The rotundity of the earth would necessitate the above conditions, but as they cannot be found to exist, the doctrine must be pronounced as only a simple theory, having no foundation in fact, a pure invention of misdirected genius, splendid in its comprehensiveness and bearing upon natural phenomena, but nevertheless mathematical and logical necessities compel its denunciation as an absolute falsehood." Dr. Rowbotham conducted several other experiments using telescopes, spirit levels, and theodolites, special precision instruments used for measuring angles in horizontal or vertical planes. By positioning them at equal heights, aimed at each other successively, he proved over and over the earth to be perfectly flat for miles without a single inch of curvature. His findings caused quite a stir in the scientific community, and thanks to 30 years of his efforts, the shape of the earth became a hot topic of debate around the turn of the 19th century. William Carpenter wrote, "Is water level, or is it not?" was a question once asked of an astronomer. "Practically, yes. Theoretically, no," was the reply. Now, when theory does not harmonize with practice, the best thing to do is to drop the theory. It is getting too late now to say, "so much the worse for the facts." To drop the theory which supposes a curved surface to standing water is to acknowledge the facts. Whenever experiments have been tried on the surface of standing water, the surface has always been found to be level. If the Earth were a globe, the surface of all standing water would be convex. This is an experimental proof that the Earth is not a globe. From the June 26, 1896 edition of the English Mechanic, since any given body of water must have a level surface, no one part higher than another, and seeing that all our oceans, a few inland seas excepted, are connected together, it follows that they are all, virtually, of the same level. Astronomers say the magical magnetism of gravity is what keeps all the oceans of the world stuck to the ball Earth. They say that because the Earth is so massive, by virtue of this mass, it creates a magic force able to hold people, oceans, and atmosphere tightly clung to the underside of the spinning ball. Unfortunately, however, they cannot provide any practical example of this on a scale smaller than the planetary. For example, a spinning wet tennis ball has the exact opposite effect of the supposed ball Earth. Any water poured over it simply falls off the sides, and giving it a spin results in water flying off 360 degrees like a dog shaking off after a bath. Astronomers concede the wet tennis ball example displays the opposite effect of their supposed ball Earth, but claim that at some unknown mass, the magic adhesive properties of gravity suddenly kick in, allowing the spinning wet tennis ball Earth to keep every drop of gravitized water stuck to the surface. Again, their theory flies in the face of all practical evidence, but they've been running with it for 500 years, so why stop now? William Carpenter wrote, "If the Earth were a globe, rolling and dashing through space at the rate of 100 miles in 5 seconds of time, the waters of seas and oceans could not, by any known law, be kept on its surface. The assertion that they could be retained under these circumstances, being an outrage upon human understanding and credulity. But as the Earth, that is, the habitable world of dry land, is found to be standing out of the water and in the water of the mighty deep, whose circumferential boundary is ice, we may throw the statement back into the teeth of those who made it, and flaunt before their faces the flag of reason and common sense, inscribed with a proof that the Earth is not a globe. In one portion of its long route, the great river Nile flows for 1,000 miles with a fall of only 1 foot. This is a feat which, of course, would be a sheer impossibility if the Earth had spherical curvature. Many other rivers, including the Congo in West Africa, the Amazon in South America, and the Mississippi in North America, all flow for thousands of miles in directions totally incompatible with the supposed globularity of the Earth as well." Thomas Winship wrote, "Rivers run down to the sea because of the inclination of their beds. Rising at an altitude above sea level, in some cases thousands of feet above the sea, they follow the easiest route to their level, the sea. The Parana and the Paraguay in South America are navigable for over 2,000 miles, and their waters run the same way until they find their level of stability where the sea tides begin. But if the world be a globe, the Amazon in South America, that flows always in an easterly direction, would sometimes be running uphill and sometimes down, according to the movement of the globe. Then the Congo in West Africa, that always pursues a westerly course to the sea, would in the same manner be running alternately up and down. When that point of the globe exactly between them was up, they would both be running up, although in opposite directions. And when the globe took half a turn, they would both be running down. We know from practical experiment that water will find its level, and cannot by any possibility remain other than level, or flat, or horizontal, whatever term may be used to express the idea. It is therefore quite out of the range of possibility that rivers could do as they would have to do on a globe." David Wardlaw Scott wrote, "Whoever heard of a river in any part of its course flowing uphill? Yet this it would require to do were the Earth a globe. Rivers like the Mississippi, which flow from the north southwards towards the equator, would need, according to modern astronomic theory, to run upwards, as the Earth at the equator is said to bulge out considerably more, or, in other words, is higher than at any other part. Thus the Mississippi, in its immense course of over 3,000 miles, would have to ascend 11 miles before it reached the Gulf of Mexico." And William Carpenter wrote, "There are rivers which flow east, west, north, and south. That is, rivers are flowing in all directions over the Earth's surface, and at the same time. Now if the Earth were a globe, some of these rivers would be flowing uphill and others down, taking it for a fact that there really is an up and down in nature, whatever form she assumes. But since rivers do not flow uphill, and the globular theory requires that they should, it is a proof that the Earth is not a globe. Whether at sea level, the top of Mount Everest, or flying 100,000 feet in the air, the always horizontal horizon line always rises up to meet the eye level of the observer and remains perfectly flat. You can test for yourself on a beach or hilltop, in a large field or desert, aboard a hot air balloon or helicopter. You will see the panoramic horizon ascend with you and remain completely level all around. If the Earth were actually a big ball, however, the horizon should sink as you ascend, not rise to your eye level, and it would dip at each end of your periphery, not remain flat all around. Standing in a rising balloon, you would have to look downwards to the horizon. The highest point of the ball Earth would be directly beneath you and declining on each side. Amateurs have sent balloons to heights of over 121,000 feet, and you can watch video online of the horizon rising with the camera level and remaining perfectly flat 360 degrees around. NASA videos and other official sources, however, such as the recent Red Bull skydive at 128,000 feet, have been caught adding fake curvature to the Earth via wide-angle lenses and post-production work. Panoramic photos atop Mount Everest also often claim to be displaying Earth's curvature, but this is simply the result of distortions and limitations inherent in wide-angle lenses. Samuel Shenton wrote, "The camera-distorted horizons have always been a misleading factor with those who have not freed their minds from the planet or globe Earth indoctrination. 3 or 4 years ago, the USIS booklet Science Horizons carried a note to the effect that the Americans hoped to produce a lens which would not distort level horizons. So far, I am not aware that such aid to truer photography has yet been made available. Flat earthers, however, can prove that due to the known laws of perspective, the horizon optically rises and remains level with the observer's or the camera's eye, no matter what height is achieved. In fact, the Earth immediately beneath balloon, airplane, rocket, or capsule presents a dish-shaped or concave-like appearance, the point of Earth immediately below the vehicle appearing the lowest. It is not the highest point of your globe Earth, with the dip or curvature of the ball sweeping away downward to a horizon far away below the eye level. If the Earth were actually a big ball 25,000 miles in circumference, the horizon would be noticeably curved even at sea level, and everything on or approaching the horizon would appear to tilt backwards slightly from your perspective. Distant buildings along the horizon would all look like leaning towers of Pisa falling away from the observer. A hot air balloon taking off, then drifting steadily away from you on a ball Earth would slowly and constantly appear to lean back more and more the farther away it flew, the bottom of the basket coming gradually into view as the top of the balloon disappears from sight. In reality, however, buildings, balloons, trees, people, anything and everything at right angles to the ground or horizon remains so regardless the distance of the observer. B. Chasbro wrote, "The marine horizon, from whatever position it is viewed, always appears to be, and is, in fact, a perfectly level line, and since this appearance is the same in all parts of the world, its surface must be level, and therefore the Earth is a plane. This may be proved to be the case by erecting at a suitable elevation on the seashore a duly leveled board or a string, at right angles to a plumb line, tightly stretched between two vertical poles. On looking towards the sea, the horizontal line for a distance of 20 miles may be easily observed, and throughout its entire length it will be found to coincide with the straight edge or string. But if the Earth were a globe, the horizontal line would form an arc of 20 miles in length, curveting both ways from the center, at the rate of 8 inches multiplied by the square of the distance. Hence the horizontal line at either end of the distance ought to be depressed some 66 feet below the horizon in the center. But as no such appearance is ever presented, it necessarily follows that the Earth cannot be a globe, or other than a plane." Anyone can prove the sea horizon perfectly straight and the entire Earth perfectly flat using nothing more than a level, tripods, and a wooden plank. At any altitude above sea level, simply fix a 6 to 12 foot long, smooth leveled board edgewise upon tripods and observe the skyline from eye level behind it. The distant horizon will always align perfectly parallel with the upper edge of the board. Furthermore, if you move in a half circle from one end of the board to the other whilst observing the skyline over the upper edge, you will be able to trace a clear, flat 10 to 20 miles depending on your altitude. This would be impossible if the Earth were a globe and the surface of water convex. If the Earth were actually a globe 25,000 miles in circumference, the horizon would align over the center of the board, but then gradually, noticeably, decline towards the extremities. Just 10 miles on each side would necessitate an easily visible curvature of 66.6 feet from each end to the center. Dr. Samuel Rowbotham wrote, "It is known that the horizon at sea, whatever distance it may extend to the right and left of the observer on land, always appears as a straight line. The following experiment has been tried in various parts of the country. At Brighton, on a rising ground near the racecourse, 2 poles were fixed in the earth, 6 yards apart, and directly opposite the sea. Between these poles a line was tightly stretched parallel to the horizon. From the center of the line, the view embraced not less than 20 miles on each side, making a distance of 40 miles. A vessel was observed sailing directly westwards. The line cut the rigging a little above the bulwarks, which it did for several hours or until the vessel had sailed the whole distance of 40 miles. The ship coming into view from the east would have to ascend an inclined plane for 20 miles until it arrived at the center of the arc, whence it would have to descend for the same distance. The square of 20 miles, multiplied by 8 inches, gives 266 feet as the amount the vessel would be below the line at the beginning and at the end of the 40 miles. From the high land near Portsmouth Harbour in Hampshire, England, looking across Spithead to the Isle of Wight, the entire base of the island, where water and land come together, composes a perfectly straight line 22 statute miles long. According to the ball earth theory, the Isle of Wight should decline 80 feet from the center on each side to account for the necessary curvature. The crosshairs of a good theodolite directed there, however, have repeatedly shown the land and water line to be perfectly level. On a clear day from the high land near Douglas Harbour on the Isle of Man, the whole length of the coast of North Wales is often plainly visible to the naked eye. From the Point of Ayr at the mouth of the River Dee to Holyhead comprises a 50-mile stretch, which has also been repeatedly found to be perfectly horizontal. If the Earth actually had curvature of 8 inches per mile squared, as NASA and modern astronomy claim, the 50-mile length of Welsh coast, seen along the horizon in Liverpool Bay, would have to decline from the center point an easily detectable 416 feet on each side. Dr. Samuel Rowbotham wrote, "But as such declination or downward curvation cannot be detected, the conclusion is logically inevitable that it has no existence. Let the reader seriously ask whether any and what reason exists in nature to prevent the fall of more than 500 feet being visible to the eye, or incapable of detection by any optical or mathematical means whatsoever. This question is especially important when it is considered that at the same distance, and on the upper outline of the same land, changes of level of only a few yards extent are quickly and unmistakably perceptible. If a man is guided by evidence and reason, and influenced by a love of truth and consistency, he cannot longer maintain that the earth is a globe. He must feel that to do so is to war with the evidence of his senses, to deny that any importance attaches to the fact and experiment, to ignore entirely the value of logical process, and to cease to rely upon practical induction." Surveyors, engineers, and architects are never required to factor the supposed curvature of the Earth into their projects, providing another proof the world is a plane, not a planet. Canals and railways, for example, are always cut and laid horizontally, often over hundreds of miles, without any allowance for curvature. One surveyor, Mr. T. Westwood, wrote in the January 1896 Earth Review magazine stating that, in leveling, I work from ordnance marks, or canal levels, to get the height above sea level. The puzzle to me used to be that over several miles each level was and is treated throughout its whole length as the same level from end to end, not the least allowance being made for curvature. One of the civil engineers in this district, after some amount of argument on each side as to the reason why no allowance for curvature was made, said he did not believe anybody would know the shape of the earth in this life. Another surveyor and engineer of 30 years wrote to the Birmingham Weekly Mercury, February 15, 1890, stating, "I am thoroughly acquainted with the theory and practice of civil engineering. However bigoted some of our professors may be in the theory of surveying according to the prescribed rules, yet it is well known amongst us that such theoretical measurements are incapable of any practical illustration. All our locomotives are designed to run on what may be regarded as true levels, or flats. There are, of course, partial inclines or gradients here and there, but they are always accurately defined and must be carefully traversed. But anything approaching to 8 inches in the mile, increasing as the square of the distance, could not be worked by any engine that was ever yet constructed. Taking one station with another all over England and Scotland, it may be stated that all the platforms are on the same relative level. The distance between eastern and western coasts of England may be set down as 300 miles. If the prescribed curvature was indeed as represented, the central stations at Rugby or Warwick ought to be close upon 3 miles higher than a cord drawn from the two extremities. If such was the case, there is not a driver or stoker within the kingdom that would be found to take charge of the train. We can only laugh at those of your readers who seriously give us credit for such venturesome exploits as running trains round spherical curves. Horizontal curves on levels are dangerous enough. Vertical curves would be 1,000 times worse, and with our rolling stock constructed as at present, physically impossible." Engineer W. Winkler wrote into the Earth Review, October 1893, regarding the Earth's supposed curvature, stating, "As an engineer of many years' standing, I saw that this absurd allowance is only permitted in school books. No engineer would dream of allowing anything of the kind. I have projected many miles of railways and many more of canals, and the allowance has not even been thought of, much less allowed for. This allowance for curvature means this, that it is 8 inches for the first mile of a canal, and increasing at the ratio by the square of the distance in miles. Thus a small navigable canal for boats, say 30 miles long, will have, by the above rule, an allowance for curvature of 600 feet. Think of that, and then please credit engineers as not being quite such fools. Nothing of the sort is allowed. We no more think of allowing 600 feet for a line of 30 miles of railway or canal than of wasting our time trying to square the circle." The Suez Canal, which connects the Mediterranean Sea with the Gulf of Suez on the Red Sea, is a clear proof of the earth's and water's non-convexity. The canal is 100 miles long, and without any locks, so the water within is an uninterrupted continuation of the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. When it was constructed, the earth's supposed curvature was not taken into account. It was dug along a horizontal datum line, 26 feet below sea level, passing through several lakes from one sea to the other, with the datum line and the water's surface running perfectly parallel over the 100 miles. The average level of the Mediterranean is 6 inches above the Red Sea, while the flood tides in the Red Sea rise 4 feet above the highest and drop 3 feet below the lowest in the Mediterranean, making the half-tide level of the Red Sea the surface of the Mediterranean Sea, and the 100 miles of water in the canal all a clear continuation of the same horizontal line. Were they instead the supposed curved line of globe-earthers, the water in the center of the canal would be 1,666 feet above the respective seas on either side. David Wardlaw Scott wrote, "The distance between the Red Sea at Suez and the Mediterranean Sea is 100 statute miles, the datum line of the canal being 26 feet below the level of the Mediterranean, and is continued horizontally the whole way from sea to sea, there not being a single lock on the canal. The surface of water being parallel with the datum line, it is thus clear that there is no curvature or globularity for the whole 100 miles between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. Had there been, according to the astronomic theory, The middle of the canal would have been 1,666 feet higher than at either end, whereas the canal is perfectly horizontal for the whole distance. The Great Canal of China, said to be 700 miles in length, was made without regard to any allowance for supposed curvature, as the Chinese believe the earth to be a stationary plane. I may also add that no allowance was made for it in the North Sea Canal, or in the Manchester Ship Canal, both recently constructed, thus clearly proving that there is no globularity in earth or sea, so that the world cannot possibly be a planet. Thomas Winship wrote, "If the earth be the globe of popular belief, it is very evident that in cutting a canal an allowance must be made for the curvature of the globe, which allowance would correspond to the square of the distance multiplied by 8 inches. From the Age of 5th August 1892 I extract the following. The German Emperor performed the ceremony of opening the gates of the Baltic and North Sea Canal in the spring of 1891. The canal starts at Holtenau on the south side of Kiel Bay and joins the Elbe 15 miles above its mouth. It is 61 miles long, 200 feet wide at the surface, and 85 feet at the bottom, the depth being 28 feet. No locks are required, as the surface of the two seas is level. Let those who believe it is the practice for surveyors to make allowance for curvature ponder over the following from the Manchester Ship Canal Company, Earth Review, October 1893. It is customary in railway and canal constructions for all levels to be referred to a datum which is nominally horizontal and is so shown on all sections. It is not the practice in laying out public works to make allowances for the curvature of the earth. The London and North Western Railway forms a straight line 180 miles long between London and Liverpool. The railroad's highest point midway at Birmingham Station is only 240 feet above sea level. If the world were actually a globe, however, curvating 8 inches per mile squared, the 180-mile stretch of rail would form an arc, with the center point at Birmingham raising a full 5,400 feet above London and Liverpool. Adding the station's actual height, 240 feet, to its theoretical inclination, 5,400 feet, gives 5,640 feet as the rail's necessary height on a globe Earth, more than 1,000 feet taller than Ben Nevis, the tallest mountain in Great Britain. Thomas Winship wrote, "In projecting railways on a globe, the datum line would be the arc of a circle corresponding to the latitude of the place. That the datum line for the railway projections is always a horizontal line proves that the general configuration of the world is horizontal. To support the globe theory, the gentlemen of the observatories should call upon the surveyor to prove that he allows the necessary amount for curvature, but this is what the learned men dare not do, as it is well known that the allowance for the supposed curvature is never made." David Wardlaw Scott wrote, "In a long line like that of the Great Pacific Railway, extending across North America, the supposed curvature would, of course, be proportionally great, extending to many miles in height, but not 1 inch was allowed by the engineers for curvature during the whole course of the construction of that vast line of railway. And if we think of it, how could it be otherwise? All railway metals must of necessity be straight, for how could any engine or carriage run with safety on a convex surface?" J.C. Bourne, in his book The History of the Great Western Railway, stated that the entire original English railroad, more than 118 miles long, that the whole line with the exception of the inclined planes, may be regarded practically as level. The British Parliament session in 1862 that approved its construction recorded in Order No. 44 for the proposed railway that "the section be drawn to the same horizontal scale as the plan, and to a vertical scale of not less than 1 inch to every 100 feet, and shall show the surface of the ground marked on the plan, the intended level of the proposed work, the height of every embankment, and the depth of every cutting, and a datum horizontal line which shall be the same throughout the whole length of the work." Thomas Winship wrote, 118 miles of level railway, and yet the surface on which it is projected a globe? Impossible. It cannot be. Early in 1898 I met a Mr. Hughes, chief officer of the steamer City of Lincoln. This gentleman told me he had projected thousands of miles of level railway in South America, and never heard of any allowance for curvature being made. On one occasion he surveyed over 1,000 miles of railway, which was a perfect straight line all the way. It is well known that in the Argentine Republic and other parts of South America there are railways thousands of miles long, without curve or gradient. In projecting railways, the world is acknowledged to be a plane, and if it were a globe, the rules of projection have yet to be discovered. Level railways prove a level world, to the utter confusion of the globular school of impractical men with high salaries and little brains. That in all surveys no allowance is made for curvature, which would be a necessity on a globe, that a horizontal line is in every case the datum line, the same line being continuous throughout the whole length of the work, and that the theodolite cuts a line at equal altitudes on either side of it, which altitude is the same as that of the instrument, clearly proves, to those who will accept proof when it is furnished, that the world is a plane and not a globe. If the earth were a sphere, airplane pilots would have to constantly correct their altitudes downwards so as to not fly straight off into outer space. If the earth were truly a sphere 25,000 miles in circumference, curvating 8 inches per mile squared, a pilot wishing to simply maintain their altitude at a typical cruising speed of 500 miles per hour would have to constantly dip their nose downwards and descend 2,777 feet, over half a mile, every minute. Otherwise, without compensation, in 1 hour's time, the pilot would find themselves 166,666 feet, 31.5 miles, higher than expected. A plane flying at a typical 35,000 feet, wishing to maintain that altitude at the upper rim of the so-called troposphere in 1 hour, would find themselves over 200,000 feet high in the mesosphere, with a steadily raising trajectory the longer they go. I have talked to several pilots, and no such compensation for the Earth's supposed curvature is ever made. When pilots set an altitude, their artificial horizon gauge remains level, and so does their course. Nothing like the necessary 2,777 foot per minute declination is ever taken into consideration. Thomas Winship wrote, "It must be obvious to the reader that if the earth be the globe of popular belief, the rules observed for navigating a vessel from one part of this globe to another must be in conformity to its figure. The datum line in navigation would be an arc of a circle, and all computations would be based on the convexity of water and worked out by spherical trigonometry. Let me preface my remarks on the important branch of our subject by stating that at sea the datum line is always a horizontal line. Spherical trigonometry is never used, and not 1 out of 1,000 shipmasters understands spherical trigonometry. Airline pilots and sea navigators fly and sail as though the earth were a plane. Pilots reach their desired altitude and maintain it effortlessly for hours, never contending with anything like the 2,777 feet per minute of forced inclination due to Earth's supposed curvature. Similarly, ship captains in navigating great distances at sea never need to factor the supposed curvature of the Earth into their calculations. Both plain sailing and great circle sailing, the most popular navigation methods, use plane, not spherical trigonometry. From Navigation and Nautical Astronomy. Plain sailing is usually defined to be the art of navigating a ship on the supposition that the earth is a plane. Even when longitude enters into consideration, it is still with the plane triangle only that we have to deal. But as the investigation here given in the text shows, the rules for plain sailing would equally hold good though the surface were a plane. Thomas Winship wrote, "It must be evident to everyone who understands what a triangle is, that the base of any such figure on a globe would be an arc of a circle, of which the center would be the center of the globe. Thus, instead of a plane triangle, the figure would contain 1 plane angle and 2 spherical angles. Hence, if the plane triangle is what we have to deal with, and such is the case, the base of the triangle would be a straight line, the ocean. That all triangulation used at sea is plane proves that the sea is a plane. The foregoing quotation states that a plane triangle is used for a spherical surface, but the rules for plane sailing would equally hold good though the surface were a plane. What fine reasoning! It is like saying that the rules for describing a circle are those used for drawing a square, but they would equally hold good though the figure were a square." Plain sailing is navigating a ship making all mathematical calculations on the assumption that the Earth is perfectly flat. If the Earth were, in fact, a sphere, such an errant assumption would lead to constant glaring inaccuracies, and the necessity for using spherical trigonometry would become obvious. Plain sailing has worked perfectly fine in both theory and practice for thousands of years, however, and plane trigonometry has time and again proven more accurate than spherical trigonometry in determining distances across the oceans. It is so commonly used at sea. Navigation in theory and practice states that, in practice, scarcely any other rules are used but those derived from plain sailing. The great and serious objection to plain sailing is that longitude cannot be found by it accurately, although in practice it is more frequently found by it than any other method. So both latitude and longitude are found most often and most accurately by assuming the Earth to be flat, more accurately even than assuming the Earth to be spherical. Thomas Winship wrote, "Plain sailing proves that the surface of water is a plane or horizontal surface, and in practice it is shown that this plane extends for many thousands of miles. Whether the voyage is outwards or homewards makes no difference, thus showing that a short voyage to the Cape and back to England can be accomplished by plain sailing. The fact that water is flat like a sheet of paper, when undisturbed by wind and tide, is my working anchor, and the powerful ground tackle of all those who reject the delusions of modern theoretical astronomy. Prove water to be convex, and we will at once and forever recant and grant you anything you like to demand." William Carpenter wrote, "If the Earth were a globe, a small model globe would be the very best, because the truest thing for the navigator to take to sea with him. But such a thing as that is not known. With such a toy as a guide, the mariner would wreck his ship of a certainty. This is a proof that the Earth is not a globe. As the mariner's compass points north and south at one and the same time, and a meridian is a north and south line, it follows that meridians can be no other than straight lines. But since all meridians on a globe are semicircles, it is an incontrovertible proof that the Earth is not a globe." And David Wardlaw Scott wrote, "The needle of this most important instrument is straight, its two ends pointing north and south at the same time. Consequently, the meridians must also be straight lines, whereas on a globe they are semicircles. Even at the equator, the needle points straight, which would be impossible, were that the midway of a vast convex globe, as in such case the one end would dip towards the north, and the other be pointed towards the sky. Again, the navigator, when he goes to sea, takes his observations and relies on the compass to guide him as to the direction in which he wishes to proceed. He does not provide himself with the model of a globe, which, if the world were a globe, would surely be the safest plan for him to adopt, but he takes flat maps or charts. Thus, in practice, he sails his ship as if the sea were horizontal, though in theory he had been erroneously taught that it is convex." If the Earth were truly a globe, the Arctic and Antarctic polar regions and areas of comparable latitude north and south of the equator should share similar conditions and characteristics such as comparable temperatures, seasonal changes, length of daylight, plant and animal life. In reality, however, the Arctic and Antarctic regions and areas of comparable latitude north and south of the equator differ greatly in many ways. Thomas Winship says, "If the Earth be the globe of popular belief, the same amount of heat and cold, summer and winter, should be experienced at the same latitudes north and south of the equator. The same number of plants and animals would be found, and the same general conditions exist. That the very opposite is the case disproves the globular assumption. The great contrasts between places at the same latitudes north and south of the equator is a strong argument against the received doctrine of the rotundity of the Earth. Antarctica is by far the coldest place on Earth, with an average annual temperature of approximately -57 degrees Fahrenheit and a record low of 135.8. The average annual temperature at the North Pole, however, is a comparatively warm 4 degrees. Throughout the year, temperatures in the Antarctic vary less than half the amount at comparable Arctic latitudes. The northern Arctic region enjoys moderately warm summers and manageable winters, whereas the southern Antarctic region never even warms enough to melt the perpetual snow and ice." Thomas Winship wrote, This uniformity of temperature partly accounts for the great accumulation of ice which is formed, not on account of the great severity of the winter, but because there is practically no summer to melt it. In the Antarctic there is eternal winter, and snow never melts. As far north as a man has traveled, he has found reindeer and hare basking in the sun, and country brilliant with rich flora. Within the Antarctic Circle, no plant is to be found. The island of Kerguelen at 49 degrees southern latitude has only 18 species of native plants that can survive its hostile climate. Compare this with the island of Iceland at 65 degrees northern latitude, 16 degrees further north of the equator than Kerguelen is south, yet Iceland is home to 870 species of native plants. On the Isle of Georgia, just 54 degrees southern latitude, the same latitude as Canada or England in the north, where dense forests of various tall trees abound, the infamous Captain Cook wrote that he was unable to find a single shrub large enough to make a toothpick. Cook wrote, "Not a tree was to be seen. The lands which lie to the south are doomed by nature to perpetual frigidness, never to feel the warmth of the sun's rays, whose horrible and savage aspect I have not words to describe. Even marine life is sparse in certain tracts of vast extent, and the sea-bird is seldom observed flying over such lonely wastes. The contrasts between the limits of organic life in Arctic and Antarctic zones is very remarkable and significant. Vegetables and land animals are found at nearly 80 degrees in the north, while from the parallel of 58 degrees in the south, the lichen and such-like plants only clothe the rocks, and seabirds and the cetaceous tribes alone are seen upon the desolate beaches. In the Arctic there are 4 clearly distinguished seasons, warm summers, and an abundance of plant and animal life, none of which can be said of the Antarctic. The Eskimo live as far north as the 79th parallel, whereas in the south no native man is found higher than the 56th. Admiral Ferdinand von Wrangel, the 19th century Russian Arctic explorer, wrote how in the north countless herds of reindeer, elks, black bears, foxes, sable, and gray squirrels fill the upland forests. Stone foxes and wolves roam over the low ground. Enormous flights of swans, geese, and ducks arrive in spring, and seek deserts where they may molt and build their nests in safety. Eagles, gulls, and owls pursue their prey along the sea coast. Ptarmigan run in troops among the bushes. Little snipes are busy among the brooks and in the morasses. The social crows seek the neighborhood of man's habitations, and when the sun shines in spring, one may sometimes even hear the cheerful note of the finch, and in autumn that of the thrush. W.N.R. Chambers, in Arctic Explorations, wrote, "Beyond the 70th degree of southern latitude, not a tree meets the eye. Wearied with the white waste of snow, forests, woods, even shrubs have disappeared, and given place to a few lichens and creeping woody plants, which scantily clothe the indurated soil. Still, in the farthest north, nature claims her birthright of beauty, and in the brief and rapid summer she brings forth numerous flowers and grasses to bloom for a few days, to be again blasted by the swiftly recurring winter. The rapid fervor of an Arctic summer had already, June 1st, converted the snowy waste into luxuriant pasture ground, rich in flowers and grass, with almost the same lively appearance as that of an English meadow." In New Zealand, situated at 42 degrees southern latitude, on the winter solstice the sun rises at 4:31 a.m. and sets at 7:29 p.m., making the longest day of the year 14 hours and 58 minutes. On the summer solstice, the New Zealand sun rises at 7:29 a.m. and sets at 4:31 p.m., making the shortest day 9 hours and 2 minutes long. Meanwhile, in England, a full 10 degrees farther north of the equator than New Zealand lies south, the longest day is 16 hours and 34 minutes, the shortest day 7 hours and 45 minutes. Therefore, the longest day in New Zealand is 1 hour and 36 minutes shorter than the longest day in England, and the shortest day in New Zealand is 1 hour and 17 minutes longer than the shortest day in England. William Swainson, an Englishman who emigrated and became Attorney General of New Zealand in the mid-19th century, lived in both countries for decades and wrote of their differences, stating, "The range of temperature is limited, there being no excess of either heat or cold. Compared with the climate of England, The summer of New Zealand is but very little warmer, though considerably longer. Even in summer, people here have no notion of going without fires in the evening. But then, though the days are very warm and sunny, the nights are always cold. For 7 months last summer, we had not one day that the sun did not shine as brilliantly as it does in England in the finest day in June, and though it has more power here, the heat is not nearly so oppressive. But then there is not the twilight which you get in England. Here it is light till about 8 o'clock, then in a few minutes it becomes too dark to see anything, and the change comes over in almost no time. The seasons are the reverse of those in England. Spring commences in September, summer in December, autumn in April, and winter in June. The days are an hour shorter at each end of the day in summer, and an hour longer in the winter than in England. In the flat earth model of the cosmos, these Arctic and Antarctic phenomena are easily accounted for and exactly what would be expected. If the sun circles over and around the earth every 24 hours, steadily traveling from tropic to tropic every 6 months, it follows that the northern, central region would annually receive far more heat and sunlight than the southern circumferential region. Since the sun must sweep over the larger southern region in the same 24 hours it has to pass over the smaller northern region, its passage must necessarily be proportionally faster as well. This is why the Antarctic morning dawn and evening twilight are very abrupt, whereas in extreme north, twilight continues for hours after sunset, and many midsummer nights the sun does not set at all. Dr. Samuel Robotham said, "If the sun is fixed and the earth revolves underneath it, the same phenomena would exist at the same distance on each side of the equator. But such is not the case. What can operate to cause the twilight in New Zealand to be so much more sudden, or the nights so much colder than in England? The southern hemisphere cannot revolve more rapidly than the northern. The latitudes are about the same, and the distance round a globe would be the same at 50 degrees south as at 50 degrees north, and as the whole would revolve once in 24 hours, the surface at the two places would pass underneath the sun with the same velocity, and the light would approach in the morning and recede in the evening in exactly the same manner. Yet the very contrary is the fact. The constant sunlight of the north develops, with the utmost rapidity, numerous forms of vegetable life, and furnishes subsistence for millions of living creatures. But in the south, where the sunlight never dwells, or lingers about a central region, but rapidly sweeps over sea and land, to complete in 24 hours the great circle of the southern circumference, it has not time to excite and stimulate the surface, and therefore, even in comparatively low southern latitudes, everything wears an aspect of desolation. These differences in the north and south could not exist if the earth were a globe, turning upon axes underneath a non-moving sun. The two hemispheres would at the same latitudes have the same degree of light and heat, and the same general phenomena, both in kind and degree. The peculiarities which are found in the south as compared with the north are only such as could exist upon a stationary plane, having a northern center, concentric with which is the path of the moving sun." And William Carpenter wrote, "Every year the sun is as long south of the equator as he is north, and if the earth were not stretched out as it is, in fact, but turned under, as the Newtonian theory suggests, it would certainly get as intensive a share of the sun's rays south as north, but the southern region being, in consequence of the fact stated, far more extensive than the region north, the sun, having to complete his journey round every 24 hours, travels quicker as he goes further south, from September to December, and his influence has less time in which to accumulate at any given point. Since, then, the facts could not be as they are if the earth were a globe, it is a proof that the earth is not a globe." During Arctic summer, from approximately the 22nd to the 25th of June, at a high enough latitude and altitude, you can watch a phenomenon known as the midnight sun, where the sun stays continuously visible in the sky for 3 days straight. The midnight sun rises on the 22nd, and for the next 72 hours never disappears from sight, slowly ascending and descending every 12 hours, showing 3 brilliant sunsets and sunrises without ever actually setting below the horizon. In the Brighton Examiner of July 1870, United States Ambassador to Norway, Mr. Campbell, described his experience witnessing the midnight sun with a group of gentlemen on a cliff 1,000 feet above the Arctic Sea at the 69th north parallel. It was late, but still sunlight. The Arctic Ocean stretched away in silent vastness at our feet. The sound of the waves scarcely reached our airy lookout. Away in the north, the huge old sun swung low along the horizon, like the slow beat of the tall clock in our grandfather's parlor corner. We all stood silently, looking at our watches. When both hands stood together at 12 midnight, the full round orb hung triumphantly above the waves. A bridge of gold running due north spangled the water between us and him. There he shone in silent majesty, which knew no setting. We involuntarily took off our hats. No word was said. Combine the most brilliant sunrise you ever saw, and its beauties will pall before the gorgeous coloring which lit up the ocean, heaven, and mountains. In half an hour the sun had swung up perceptibly on its beat. The colors had changed to those of morning. A fresh breeze had rippled over the florid sea. One songster after another piped out of the ground behind us. We had slid into another day. From The Land of the Midnight Sun. Tourists from Haparanda prefer going to Avançada, a hill 680 feet above the sea, from which, through 8 or 10 miles south of the Arctic Circle, they can see the midnight sun for 3 days. As the voyage drew to a close, and we approached the upper end of the Gulf of Bothnia, the twilight had disappeared, and between the setting and rising of the sun hardly 1 hour elapsed. Haparanda is in 65 degrees 31 minutes north latitude and 41 miles south of the Arctic Circle. It is 1 degree 18 minutes farther north than Archangel and in the same latitude as the most northern part of Iceland. The sun rises on the 21st of June at 12:01 a.m. and sets at 11:37 p.m. From the 22nd to the 25th of June, the traveler may enjoy the sight of the midnight sun from Avançada, a hill 680 feet high and about 45 miles distant. If the Earth were actually a spinning globe revolving around the sun, the only place such a phenomena as the midnight sun could be observed would be at the poles. Any other vantage point from 89 degrees latitude downwards could never, regardless of any tilt or inclination, see the sun for 24 hours straight. To see the sun for an entire revolution on a spinning globe at a point other than the poles, you would have to be looking through miles and miles of land and sea for part of the revolution. Anyone below the 89th parallel could never witness the sun for 72 hours, 3 whole revolutions, straight, because to do so would be to assume you are somehow seeing through the globe and to the sun on the other side. Since such an assumption is ridiculous, and yet the midnight sun can clearly be seen as low as the 65th parallel, this is another absolute proof that the Earth is the flat, stationary center of the universe. Thomas Winship wrote, "If the Earth be a globe, at midnight the eye would have to penetrate thousands of miles of land and water, even at 65 degrees north latitude, in order to see the sun at midnight. That the sun can be seen for days together in the far north during the northern summer proves that there is something very seriously wrong with the globular hypothesis. Besides this, how is it that the midnight sun is never seen in the south during the southern summer? Cook penetrated as far south as 71 degrees, Weddell in 1893 reached as far as 74 degrees, and Sir James C. Ross in 1841 and 1842 reached the 78th parallel. But I am not aware that any of these navigators have left it on record that the sun was seen at midnight in the south." Heliocentrists also cannot explain why the midnight sun phenomena is not experienced anywhere in the southern hemisphere at any time of year. Quite to the contrary, it has been recorded by the Royal Belgian Geographical Society in Expedition Antarctique Belge that during the most severe part of the Antarctic winter, from 71 degrees south latitude onwards, the sun sets on May 17th and is not seen above the horizon again until July 21st. This is completely at odds with the ball Earth theory, but easily explained by the flat Earth model. The midnight sun is seen from high altitudes in extreme northern latitudes during Arctic summer because the sun, at its innermost cycle, is circling tightly enough around the polar center that it remains visible above the horizon for someone at such a vantage point. Likewise, in extreme southern latitudes, during Arctic summer, the sun completely disappears from view for over 2 months, because there, at the northern tropic, at the innermost arc of its boomerang journey, the sun is circling the northern center too tightly to be seen from the southern circumference. Samuel Rowbotham wrote, "It is evident that in the great encircling oceans of the south, and the numerous islands and parts of continents which exist beyond that part of the earth where the sun is vertical, cannot have their days and nights, seasons, etc., precisely like those in the northern region. The north is a center, and the south is that center radiated or thrown out to a vast oceanic circumference, terminating in circular walls of ice, which form an impenetrable frozen barrier. Hence, the phenomena referred to as existing in the north must be considerably modified in the south. For instance, the north being central, the light of the sun advancing and receding gives long periods of alternate light and darkness at the actual center, but in the far south, the sun, even when moving in its outer path, can only throw its light to a certain distance, beyond which there must be perpetual darkness. No evidence exists of there being long periods of light and darkness regularly alternating as in the north. In the north, in summertime, when the sun is moving in its inner path, the light shines continually for months together over the central region and rapidly develops numerous forms of animal and vegetable life." In typical reverse-engineered damage control fashion, trying to explain away the midnight sun, problematic Arctic and Antarctic phenomena, and the fact that Polaris can be seen to 23.5 degrees south of the equator, desperate heliocentrists in the late 19th century again modified their theory to say the ball Earth actually tilts back 25.5 degrees on its vertical axis, thus explaining away many problems in one swoop. If it simply tilted the same direction constantly, however, this would still not explain the phenomena, because after 6 months of supposed orbital motion around the sun, any amount of tilt would be perfectly opposite, thus negating their alleged explanation for Arctic and Antarctic irregularities. To account for this, heliocentrists then added that the Earth also wobbles in a complex combination of patterns known as planetary nutation, the Chandler wobble, and axial precession, which, in their vivid imaginations, somehow explains away common sense. Common sense, however, says that if the heat of the sun travels 93 million miles to reach us, a small axial tilt and wobble, the difference of a few thousand miles, should be completely negligible. If the ball Earth actually spun around 93 million miles from the sun, regardless of any tilt or wobble, temperature and climate the whole world over should be almost completely uniform. If the heat of the sun truly traveled 93 million miles to reach the Earth's equator, the extra few thousand miles to the poles, regardless of any supposed tilt or wobble, no matter how extreme, would surely be negligible in negating such intense heat. E. Eschini wrote, "The supposition that the seasons are caused by the Earth's annual motion round the sun at a mean distance of 93 million miles is grotesque. According to Piazzi, the size of the sun is in proportion to the Earth as 329,360 to 1. The diameter exceeds that of the Earth 112 times. The Earth appears, as Biot says by this statement, a mere grain of sand as compared to the sun. This enormous expanse of light, focused on a rotating grain of sand, at the distance of 93 millions of miles, would cause the same season throughout it. The paltry few miles, in comparison, that separates London from Cape Town could never cause diverse seasons, neither would the distance from London to the Riviera justify the difference in the climate that characterizes the two places. Common sense also says if the Earth were actually a ball spinning daily with uniform speed around the sun, there should be exactly 12-hour days and 12-hour nights everywhere, all year round, regardless of any alleged tilt or inclination. Half the sphere would always be lit, and the other half not. The great variety and length of days and nights throughout the year all over Earth testifies to the fact we do not live on a spinning ball planet. There cannot exist phenomena such as this on a globe, nor the midnight sun, nor anything like Antarctic winter, where the sun is nowhere to be found for over 2 months per year. NASA and modern astronomy say the Earth is a giant globe spinning 1,000 miles per hour around its central axis, traveling 67,000 mile per hour circles around the sun, spiraling 500,000 miles per hour around the Milky Way, while the entire galaxy rockets a ridiculous 670 million miles per hour through the universe, with all of these motions originating from an alleged Big Bang cosmogenic explosion 14 billion years ago. That's a grand total of 670,568,000 miles per hour in several different directions we're all supposedly speeding along at simultaneously. No one has ever seen, felt, heard, measured, or proven such motion, yet the vast majority of people unquestioningly accept that the clearly motionless Earth beneath their feet is actually moving over 600 million miles per hour. NASA and modern astronomy say Polaris, the North Pole star, is somewhere between 323 and 434 light years, or about 2 quadrillion miles away from us. Firstly, note that is between 1.9 quadrillion to 2.6 quadrillion miles, making a difference of over 600 trillion miles. If modern astronomy cannot even agree on the distance to stars within hundreds of trillions of miles, perhaps their science is flawed and their theory needs re-examining. However, even granting them their obscurely distant stars, heliocentric astronomers cannot adequately explain how Polaris manages to always remain perfectly aligned straight above the North Pole. If the globe Earth was really spinning west to east 1,000 miles per hour, orbiting the sun counterclockwise at 67,000 miles per hour, spiraling around the outer arms of the Milky Way at 500,000 miles per hour, while shooting through the universe at 670 million miles per hour, how is it even conceptually possible that Polaris, 2 quadrillion miles away, day after day, year after year, always maintains its alignment straight above the North Pole? That would mean from 2 quadrillion miles away, Polaris would have to be perfectly mirroring Earth's several simultaneous wobbling, spinning, spiraling, and shooting motions. Polaris would have to be shooting the same direction through the universe at exactly 670 million miles per hour. It would have to be following the same 500,000 mile per hour, 225 million year spiral around the Milky Way, and mirroring the same 67,000 mile per hour, 365-day orbit around our sun. Or, the Earth is stationary, as common sense and everyday experience testifies. William Carpenter wrote, "It is supposed in the regular course of the Newtonian theory that the Earth is in June about 190 million miles away from its position in December. Now since we can in middle north latitudes see the North Star on looking out of a window that faces it, and out of the very same corner of the very same pane of glass in the very same window all the year round, it is proof enough for any man in his senses that we have made no motion at all." Not only this, but viewed from a ball Earth, Polaris, situated almost straight over the North Pole, should not be visible anywhere in the southern hemisphere. For Polaris to be seen from the southern hemisphere of a globular Earth, the observer would have to be somehow looking through the globe, and miles of land and sea would have to be transparent. Polaris can be seen, however, up to approximately 23.5 degrees south latitude. Dr. Robotham wrote, "If the Earth is a sphere and the pole star hangs over the northern axis, it would be impossible to see it for a single degree beyond the equator, or 90 degrees from the pole. The line of sight would become a tangent to the sphere, and consequently several thousand miles of and divergent from the direction of the pole star. Many cases, however, are on record of the North Polar Star being visible far beyond the equator, as far even as the Tropic of Capricorn." William Carpenter wrote, "The astronomer's theory of a globular Earth necessitates the conclusion that if we travel south of the equator, to see the North Star is an impossibility. Yet it is well known that this star has been seen by navigators when they have been more than 20 degrees south of the equator. This fact, like hundreds of other facts, puts the theory to shame and gives us a proof that the Earth is not a globe." To account for this glaring problem in their model, desperate heliocentrists since the late 19th century have claimed the ball Earth actually tilts a convenient 23.5 degrees back on its vertical axis. Even this brilliant revision to their theory cannot account for the visibility of many other constellations, though. For instance, Ursa Major, very close to Polaris, can be seen from 90 degrees north latitude, the North Pole, all the way down to 30 degrees south latitude. The constellation Vulpecula can be seen from 90 degrees north latitude all the way to 55 degrees south latitude. Taurus, Pisces, and Leo can be seen from 90 degrees north all the way to 65 degrees south. Aquarius and Libra can be seen from 65 degrees north to 90 degrees south. The constellation Virgo is visible from 80 degrees north down to 80 degrees south, and Orion can be seen from 85 degrees north all the way to 75 degrees south latitude. An observer on a ball Earth, regardless of any tilt or inclination, would not logically be able to see this far. Dr. Samuel Rowbotham wrote, "Another thing is certain, that from within the equator the North Pole star and the constellations Ursa Major, Ursa Minor, and many others can be seen from every meridian simultaneously, whereas in the south, from the equator, neither the so-called South Pole star nor the remarkable constellation of the Southern Cross can be seen simultaneously from every meridian, showing that all the constellations of the south, supposed pole star included, sweep over a great southern arc and across the meridian from their rise in the evening to their setting in the morning. But if the Earth is a globe, Sigma Octantis, the South Pole star, and the Southern Cross, a southern circumpolar constellation, they would all be visible at the same time from every longitude on the same latitude, as is the case with the Northern Pole star and the northern circumpolar constellations. Such, however, is not the case. Some heliocentrists have even tried to suggest that the pole star's gradual declination overhead as an observer travels southwards is proof of a globular Earth. Far from it, the declination of the pole star or any other object is simply a result of the law of perspective. The law of perspective dictates that the angle and height at which an object is seen diminishes the farther one recedes from the object, until at a certain point the line of sight and the seemingly uprising surface of the Earth converges to a vanishing point, i.e. the horizon line, beyond which the object is invisible. Thomas Winship wrote, "If we select a flat street a mile long containing a row of lamps, it will be noticed that from where we stand the lamps gradually decline to the ground, the last one being apparently quite on the ground. Take the lamp at the end of the street and walk away from it 100 yards, and it will appear to be much nearer to the ground than it was when we were close to it. Keep on walking away from it, and it will appear to be gradually depressed until it is last seen on the ground and then disappears. Now, according to the astronomers, the whole mile was only depressed about 8 inches from one end to the other, so that this 8 inches could not account for the enormous depression of the light as we recede from it. This proves that the depression of the pole star can and does take place in relation to a flat surface simply because we increase our distance from it, the same as from the street lamp. In other words, the farther away we get from any object above us, as a star for example, the more it is depressed, and if we go far enough it will sink or appear to sink to the horizon and then disappear. The writer has tried the street lamp many times with the same result." And Dr. Rowbotham wrote, "It has often been urged that the Earth must be a globe because the stars in the southern hemisphere move round a south polar star in the same way that those of the north revolve around the northern pole star. This is another instance of the sacrifice of truth and denial of the evidence of our senses for the purpose of supporting a theory which is in every sense false and unnatural. It is known to every observer that the North Pole star is the center of a number of constellations which move over the Earth in a circular direction. Those nearest to it, as the Great Bear, etc., are always visible in England during their whole 24 hours revolution. Those farther away southwards rise north-northeast and set south-southwest. Still further south they rise east by north and set west by north. The farthest south visible from England, the rising is more to the east and southeast, and the setting to the west and southwest. But all the stars visible from London rise and set in a way which is not compatible with the doctrine of rotundity. For instance, if we stand with our backs to the north, on the high land known as Arthur's Seat near Edinburgh, and note the stars in the zenith of our position, and watch for several hours, the zenith stars will gradually recede to the northwest. If we do the same on Woodhouse Moor, near Leeds, or on any of the mountain tops in Yorkshire or Derbyshire, the same phenomenon is observed. The same thing may be seen from the top of Primrose Hill near Regent's Park, London, from Hampstead Heath or Shooter's Hill near Woolwich. If we remain all night, we shall observe the same stars rising toward our position from the northeast, showing that the path of all the stars between ourselves and the northern center move round the North Pole star as a common center of rotation, just as they must do over a plane such as the earth is proved to be. It is undeniable that upon a globe zenith stars would rise, pass overhead, and set in the plane of the observer's position. If now we carefully watch in the same way the zenith stars from the Rock of Gibraltar, the very same phenomenon is observed. The same is also the case from the Cape of Good Hope, Sydney, and Melbourne in Australia, in New Zealand, in Rio de Janeiro, Montevideo, Valparaiso, and other places in the south. If then the zenith stars of all the places on the earth where special observations have been made rise from the morning horizon to the zenith of an observer and descend to the evening horizon, not in a plane of the position of such observer, but in an arc of a circle concentric with the northern center, the earth is thereby proved to be a plane, and rotundity altogether disproved, shown indeed to be impossible. Many people think that modern astronomy's ability to accurately predict lunar and solar eclipses is a result and proof positive of the heliocentric theory of the universe. The fact of the matter, however, is that eclipses have been accurately predicted by cultures worldwide for thousands of years before the heliocentric ball Earth was even a glimmer in Copernicus's imagination. Ptolemy, in the 1st century AD, accurately predicted eclipses for 600 years on the basis of a flat, stationary Earth with equal precision as anyone living today. All the way back in 600 BC, Thales accurately predicted an eclipse which ended the war between the Medes and the Lydians. Eclipses happen regularly with precision in 18-year cycles, so regardless of geocentric or heliocentric, flat or globe Earth cosmologies, eclipses can be accurately calculated independent of such factors. Samuel Rowbotham said, "Those who are unacquainted with the methods of calculating eclipses and other phenomena are prone to look upon the correctness of such calculations as powerful arguments in favor of the doctrine of the earth's rotundity and the Newtonian philosophy generally. One of the most pitiful manifestations of ignorance of the true nature of theoretical astronomy is the ardent inquiry so often made, 'How is it possible for that system to be false which enables its professors to calculate to a second of time both solar and lunar eclipses for hundreds of years to come?' The supposition that such calculations are an essential part of the Newtonian or any other theory is entirely gratuitous and exceedingly fallacious and misleading. Whatever theory is adopted, or if all theories are discarded, the same calculations can be made." Gerard Hickson said, "The Chaldeans used to predict the eclipses 3,000 years ago with a degree of accuracy that is only surpassed by seconds in these days, because we have wonderful clocks which they had not. Yet they had an entirely different theory of the universe than we have. The fact is that eclipses occur with a certain exact regularity, just as Christmas and birthdays do, every so many years, days, and minutes, so that anyone who has the records of the eclipses of thousands of years can predict them as well as the best astronomers without any knowledge of their cause." Samuel Rowbotham said, "The simplest method of ascertaining any future eclipse is to take the tables which have been formed during hundreds of years of careful observation, or each observer may form his own tables by collecting a number of old almanacs, one for each of the last 40 years, separate the times of the eclipses in each year, and arrange them in a tabular form. On looking over the various items, he will soon discover parallel cases, or cycles of eclipses, that is, taking the eclipses in the first year of his table, and examining those of each succeeding year, he will notice peculiarities in each year's phenomena, but on arriving to the items of the 19th and 20th years, he will perceive that some of the eclipses in the earlier part of the table will have been now repeated, that is to say, the times and characters will be alike. Tables of the places of the sun and moon, of eclipses, and of kindred phenomena have existed for thousands of years, and were formed independently of each other by the Chaldean, Babylonian, Egyptian, Hindu, Chinese, and other ancient astronomers. Modern science has had nothing to do with these. Another assumption and supposed proof of Earth's shape, heliocentrists claim that lunar eclipses are caused by the shadow of the ball Earth occulting the moon. The idea is that the sun, earth, and moon spheres perfectly align like 3 billiard balls in a row, so that the sun's light casts the earth's shadow onto the moon. Unfortunately for heliocentrists, this explanation is rendered completely invalid due to the fact that lunar eclipses have happened and continue to happen regularly when both the sun and moon are still visible together above the horizon. For the sun's light to be casting Earth's shadow onto the moon, the three bodies must be aligned in a straight 180-degree syzygy. William Carpenter says, "The Newtonian hypothesis involves the necessity of the sun, in the case of a lunar eclipse, being on the opposite side of a globular Earth to cast its shadow on the moon. But since eclipses of the moon have taken place with both the sun and the moon above the horizon, it follows that it cannot be the shadow of the Earth that eclipses the moon, and that the theory is a blunder." Samuel Rowbotham said, "That the eclipser of the moon is a shadow at all is assumption. No proof whatever is offered. That the moon receives her light from the sun, and that therefore her surface is darkened by the Earth intercepting the sun's light, is not proved. It is not proved that the Earth moves in an orbit round the sun, and therefore by being in different positions, conjunction of sun, earth, and moon, day sometimes occur. The contrary has been clearly proved, that the moon is not eclipsed by a shadow, that she is self-luminous, and not merely a reflector of solar light, and therefore could not possibly be obscured or eclipsed by a shadow from any object whatsoever, and that the Earth is devoid of motion, either on axes or in an orbit through space. Hence, to call that an argument for the Earth's rotundity, where every necessary proposition is only assumed, and in relation to which direct and practical evidence to the contrary is abundant, is to stultify the judgment and every other reasoning faculty." And F.H. Cook wrote, "According to the globular theory, a lunar eclipse occurs when the sun, earth, and moon are in a direct line, but it is on record that since about the 15th century, over 50 eclipses have occurred while both the sun and moon have been visible above the horizon. As early as the time of Pliny, there are records of lunar eclipses happening while both the sun and moon are visible in the sky. The Greenwich Royal Observatory recorded that during the lunar eclipses of July 17, 1590, November 3, 1648, June 16, 1666, and May 26, 1668, the moon rose eclipsed, while the sun was still above the horizon. McCullough's Geography recorded that on September 20th, 1717, and April 20th, 1837, the moon appeared to rise eclipsed before the sun had set. Sir Henry Holland also noted in his Recollections of Past Life the April 20th, 1837 phenomena where the moon rose eclipsed before the sun set. The Daily Telegraph recorded it happening again on January 17, 1870, then again in July of the same year, and it continues to happen during lunar eclipses to this very day. Thomas Winship wrote, "It is alleged by the learned that at a lunar eclipse the Earth casts a shadow on the moon by intercepting the light of the sun. The shadow, it is alleged, is circular, and as only a globe can cast a circular shadow, and as that shadow is cast by the Earth, of course the Earth is a globe. In fact, what better proof could any reasonable person require? Powerful reasoning, says the dupe. Let us see. I have already cited a case where sun and moon have been seen with the moon eclipsed, and as the Earth was not between, or they both could not have been seen, the shadow said to be on the moon could not possibly have been cast by the Earth. But as refraction is charged with raising the moon above the horizon, when it is said to be really beneath, and the amount of refraction made to tally with what would be required to square the matter, let us see how refraction would act in regard to a shadow. Refraction can only exist where the object and the observer are in different densities. If a shilling be put in the bottom of a glass and observed, there is no refraction. Refraction casts the image of the shilling upwards, but a shadow always downwards. If a basin be taken and put near a light, so that the shadow will shorten inwards and downwards, but if the rod is allowed to rest in the basin, and water poured in, the rod will appear to be bent upwards. This places the matter beyond dispute, and proves that it is out of the range of possibility that the shadow said to be on the moon could be that of the earth. In an attempt to explain away the inconsistencies in their theory, heliocentrists usually claim light refraction must be happening on a scale large enough to account for the phenomena. George G. Carey, in his Astronomy and Astronomical Instruments, claims that this is the reason the full moon has sometimes been seen eclipsed above the horizon before the sunset, due to a horizontal refraction of 36 or 37 minutes, generally about 33 minutes, which is equal to the diameter of the sun or moon. Even if this highly implausible, reverse-engineered damage control explanation is accepted, it cannot explain how earthbound observers are supposedly able to see 12,000 miles, 180 degrees, around the globe. Thomas Winship wrote, "Even if we admit refraction, and that to the extent seemingly required to prove that when the eclipsed moon is seen above the horizon, we are still confronted with a fact which entirely annihilates every theory propounded to account for the phenomena. Taking the astronomer's own equation of 8 inches to the mile, varying inversely as the square of the distance for the curvature of the earth, where sun and moon are both seen at a lunar eclipse, the center of the sun is said to be in a straight line with the centers of the earth and the moon, each luminary being 90 degrees from the observer. This would give about 6,000 miles as the distance of each body from the observer. Now what is the curvature in 6,000 miles? No less than 24 million feet, or 4,545 miles. Therefore, according to the astronomer's own showing, an observer would have to get up into space 4,545 miles before he could see both the sun and moon above his horizon at a lunar eclipse. As lunar eclipses have been seen from the surface of the earth, with sun and moon both above the horizon at the same time, it is conclusively proved that there is no curvature of the earth, and therefore that the world is a plane and cannot by any possibility be globular. This one proof alone demolishes forever the fabric of astronomical imagination and popular credulity." One of heliocentrists' favorite supposed proofs of their ball Earth theory is the ability for ships and planes to circumnavigate, to sail or fly at right angles to the North Pole, and eventually return to their original location. Since the North Pole and Antarctica are covered in ice and guarded no-fly zones, however, no ships or planes have ever been known to circumnavigate the Earth in north-south directions, only east-west. And herein lies the rub. East or westbound circumnavigation can just as easily be performed on a flat plane as it can on a globular sphere. Just as a compass can place its center point on a flat piece of paper and trace a circle either way around the pole, so can a ship or plane circumnavigate a flat Earth. The only kind of circumnavigation which could not happen on a flat Earth is north-south bound, which is likely the very reason for the heavily enforced flight restrictions. Flight restrictions originating from none other than the United Nations, the same United Nations which haughtily uses the flat Earth map as its official logo and flag. David Wardlaw Scott says, "Circular sailing no more proves the world to be a globe than an equilateral triangle. The sailing round the world would of course take very much longer, but in principle it is exactly the same as that of the yachtsman circumnavigating the Isle of Wight. Let me give a simple illustration. A boy wants to sail his iron toy boat by a magnet, so he gets a basin, in the middle of which he places a soap dish or anything else which he may think suitable to represent the earth, and then fills the basin with water to display the sea. He puts his boat and draws it by the magnet round his little world, but the boat never passes over the rim to sail under the basin, as if that were globular, instead of being simply circular. So is it in this world of ours. From the extreme south we can sail from east to west or from west to east around it, but we cannot sail from north to south or from south to north, for we cannot break through intervening lands, nor pass the impenetrable ramparts of ice and rocks which enclose the great southern circumference." Samuel Rowbotham says, A very good illustration of the circumnavigation of a plane will be seen by taking a round table and fixing a pin in the center to represent the magnetic pole. To this central pin attach a string drawn out to any distance towards the edge of the table. This string may represent the meridian of Greenwich, extending due north and south. If now a pencil or other object is placed across or at right angles to the string, at any distance between the center and the circumference of the table, it will represent a vessel standing due east and west. Now move the pencil and the string together in either direction, and it will be seen that by keeping the vessel or pencil square to the string, it must of necessity describe a circle round the magnetic center and return to the starting point in the opposite direction to that in which it first sailed. So the ball earther's logical argument is that only a globe can be circumnavigated, the Earth has been circumnavigated, and therefore the Earth is a globe. This is indeed a logical modus ponens statement, but the conclusion is rendered invalid because the first premise, that only a globe can be circumnavigated, is categorically false. Another similarly logical but unsound argument ball earthers make is that only on a globe would one gain or lose time when sailing or flying east or west. Time is gained or lost when sailing or flying east to west, and therefore the Earth is a globe. Again, the logical conclusion is rendered invalid, and the argument unsound because the first premise is incorrect. The same effect would be experienced on a stationary flat Earth as it would on a spinning ball Earth. William Carpenter says, "The sun, as he travels round over the surface of the earth, brings noon to all places on the successive meridians which he crosses. His journey being made in a westerly direction, places east of the sun's positions have had their noon, whilst places to the west of the sun's position have still yet to get it. Therefore, if we travel easterly, we arrive at those parts of the earth where time is more advanced. The watch in our pocket has to be put on, or we may be said to gain time. If, on the other hand, we travel westerly, we arrive at places where it is still morning, the watch has to be put back, and it may be said that we lose time. But if we travel easterly so as to cross the 180th meridian, there is a loss there of a day, which will neutralize the gain of a whole circumnavigation. And if we travel westerly and cross the same meridian, we experience the gain of a day, which will compensate for the loss during a complete circumnavigation in that direction. The fact of losing or gaining time in sailing round the world, then instead of being evidence of the earth's rotundity as it is imagined to be, is in its practical exemplification an everlasting proof that the earth is not a globe." Another favorite supposed proof of ball earthers is the appearance from an observer on shore of ships' hulls being obfuscated by the water and disappearing from view when sailing away towards the horizon. Their claim is that ships' hulls disappear before their mastheads because the ship is beginning its declination around the convex curvature of the ball earth. Once again, however, their hasty conclusion is drawn from a faulty premise, namely that only on a ball earth can this phenomenon occur. The fact of the matter is that the law of perspective on plane surfaces dictates and necessitates the exact same occurrence. For example, a girl wearing a dress walking away towards the horizon will appear to sink into the earth the farther away she walks. Her feet will disappear from view first, and the distance between the ground and the bottom of her dress will gradually diminish until, after about a half a mile, it seems like her dress is touching the ground as she walks on invisible legs. The same happens with cars speeding away, the axles gradually getting lower and the wheels vanish until it appears as if the car is gliding along its body. Such is the case on plane surfaces. The lowest parts of objects receding from a given point of observation necessarily disappear before the highest. David Wardlaw Scott says, "This law of perspective meets us on every hand, and cannot be gainsaid. If, in a straight line, we look at a frozen lake from a certain distance, we shall observe people who appear to be skating on their knees, but if we approach sufficiently near, we shall see them performing graceful motions on their feet. Farther, if we look through a straight tunnel, we shall notice that the roof and the roadway below converge to a point of light at the end. It is the same law which makes The hills sink to the horizon as the observer recedes, which explains how the ship's hull disappears in the offing. I would also remark that when the sea is undisturbed by waves, the hull can be restored to sight by the aid of a good telescope long after it has disappeared from the naked eye, thus proving that the ship had not gone down behind the watery hill of a convex globe, but is still sailing on the level of a plain sea. Not only is the disappearance of ships' hulls explained by the law of perspective, it is proven undeniably true with the aid of a good telescope. If you watch a ship sailing away into the horizon with the naked eye until its hull has completely disappeared from view under the supposed curvature of the earth, then look through a telescope, you will notice the entire ship quickly zooms back into view, hull and all, proving that the disappearance was caused by the law of perspective and not by a wall of curved water. Samuel Rowbotham says, "On any frozen lake or canal, notably on the Bedford Canal, in the country of Cambridge, in winter and on a clear day, skaters may be observed several miles away, seeming to glide upon limbs without feet, skates and boots quite invisible to the unaided eye, but distinctly visible through a good telescope. But even on the sea, when the water is very calm, if a vessel is observed until it is just hull down, a powerful telescope turned upon it will restore the hull to sight, from which it must be concluded that the lower part of a receding ship disappears through the influence of perspective, and not from sinking behind the summit of a convex surface." All earthers will often also quip that if the earth were flat, then we could see all over it. But this is of course ignorant and inaccurate. If you stand on the beach, a plain or prairie, you will find the horizon extends about 3 to 6 miles around you, depending on the weather and your eyesight. The range of the human eye, our field of vision, is from 110 to 1 degree, and the smallest angle under which an object can still be seen is 1/60th of 1 degree, so that when an object is 3,000 times its own diameter away from an observer, it will cease to be visible. So, for example, the farthest distance at which one can see a 1-inch diameter penny is 3,000 inches, or 250 feet. Therefore, if a ship's hull is 10 feet above the water, it will disappear from the unaided eye at 3,000 times 10 feet, or 6 miles. This has nothing to do with the supposed convexity or curvature of the earth, and everything to do with the common law of perspective. Thomas Winship says, "The horizon of an observer is distant or near according to the greatness or otherwise of his elevation above the surface of the supposed globe. If he stands 24 feet above sea level, he is said to be in the center of a circle which bounds his vision, the radius of which in any direction on a clear day is 6 miles. A local gentleman tells me that he has watched a boat race in New Zealand, seeing the boats all the way out and home, the distance being 9 miles from where he was standing on the beach. I have seen the hull of a steamer with the naked eye at an elevation of not more than 24 feet, at a distance of 12 miles, and in taking observations along the South African coast, have sometimes had an horizon of at least 20 miles at an elevation of 20 feet only. The distance of the horizon, or vanishing point, where the sky appears to touch the earth and sea, is determined largely by the weather, and, when that is clear, by the power of our vision. This is proved by the fact that the telescope will increase the distance of the horizon very greatly and bring objects into view which are entirely beyond the range of vision of the unaided eye. But as no telescope can pierce a segment of water, the legitimate conclusion we are forced to arrive at is that the surface of water is level, and that therefore the shape of the world cannot be globular, and on such a flat or level surface, the greater the elevation of the observer, the longer will his range of vision be, and thus the farther he can see." Samuel Rowbotham says, "On the shore near Waterloo, a few miles to the north of Liverpool, a good telescope was fixed. At an elevation of 6 feet above the water, it was directed to a large steamer just leaving the River Mersey and sailing out to Dublin. Gradually the masthead of the receding vessel came nearer to the horizon, until at length, after more than 4 hours had elapsed, it disappeared. The ordinary rate of sailing of the Dublin steamers was fully 8 miles an hour, so that the vessel would be at least 32 miles distant when the masthead came to the horizon. The 6 feet of elevation of the telescope would require 3 miles to be deducted for convexity, which would leave 29 miles, the square of which multiplied by 8 inches gives 560 feet, deducting 80 feet for the height of the main mast, and we find that, according to the doctrine of rotundity, the masthead of the outward-bound steamer should have been 480 feet below the horizon. Many other experiments of this kind have been made upon sea-going steamers, and always with results entirely incompatible with the theory that the earth is a globe. In the mid-19th century, a Frenchman named Léon Foucault became famous for swinging pendulums and claiming their consequent motions were proof of the Earth's diurnal rotation. Since then, Foucault pendulums have regularly been swinging at museums and exposition halls worldwide, purporting to provide everlasting perpetual proof of the heliocentric spinning ball Earth theory. The truth is, however, unbeknownst to most of the duped public, that Foucault's pendulum is a failed experiment which proves nothing but how easy it is for pseudoscience to deceive the malleable masses. Lady Blunt says, "This pendulum, modern scientists tell us, affords a visible proof that we are living on a whirling globe, which, according to a work on science, now before me, is spinning upon its so-called axis at the rate of over 1,000 miles an hour at the equator, and in addition to other motions is rushing on an everlasting tour round the sun, the diameter of which is said to be 813,000 miles, and its weight 354,936 times greater than the Earth, from which it is said to be about 93 million miles distant, at the rate of over 1,000 miles per minute. Now, to prove that the Earth really has these motions, a pendulum is suspended at the show. The showman sets motion, and bids the gaping world of thoughtless men and women to behold a proof that we are living on a whirling globe which is rushing away through space." William Carpenter says, "Astronomers have made experiments with pendulums which have been suspended from the interior of high buildings, and have exulted over the idea of being able to prove the rotation of the earth on its axis by the varying direction taken by the pendulum over a prepared table underneath, asserting that the table moved round under the pendulum, instead of the pendulum shifting and oscillating in different directions over the table. But, since it has been found that, as often as not, the pendulum went round the wrong way for the rotation theory, chagrin has taken place of exultation, and we have a proof of the failure of astronomers in their efforts to substantiate their theory." So to begin with, Foucault's pendulums do not uniformly swing in any one direction. Sometimes they rotate clockwise, and sometimes counterclockwise. Sometimes they fail to rotate, and sometimes they rotate far too much. Scientists who have repeated variations of the experiment have conceded time and again that, quote, "it was difficult to avoid giving the pendulum some slight lateral bias at starting." The behavior of the pendulum actually depends on 1. The initial force beginning its swing, and 2. The ball and socket joint used, which most readily facilitates circular motion over any other. The supposed rotation of the earth is completely inconsequential and irrelevant to the pendulum's swing. If the alleged constant rotation of the earth affected pendulums in any way, then there should be no need to manually start pendulums in motion. If Earth's diurnal rotation caused the 360-degree uniform diurnal rotation of pendulums, then there should not exist a stationary pendulum anywhere on Earth. Samuel Rowbotham says, "First, when a pendulum constructed according to the plan of Mr. Foucault is allowed to vibrate, its plane of vibration is often variable, not always. The variation, when it does occur, is not uniform, is not always the same in the same place, nor always the same either in its rate or velocity, or in its direction. It cannot therefore be taken as evidence, for that which is inconstant cannot be used in favor of or against any given proposition. It therefore is not evidence and proves nothing. Secondly, if the plane of vibration is observed to change, where is the connection between such change and the supposed motion of the earth? What principle of reasoning guides the experimenter to the conclusion that it is the earth which moves underneath the pendulum, and not the pendulum which moves over the earth? What logical right or necessity forces one conclusion in preference to the other? Thirdly, Why was not the peculiar arrangement of the point of suspension of the pendulum specially considered in regards to its possible influence upon the plane of oscillation? Was it not known, or was it overlooked, or was it in the climax of theoretical revelry ignored that a ball and socket joint is one which facilitates circular motion more readily than any other? Lady Blunt says, "We believe, with all due deference to the pendulum and its proprietor, that it proves nothing but the craftiness of the inventor, and we can only describe the show and showman as deceptions. A thing so childish as this pendulum proof that it can only be described as one of the most simple and ridiculous attempts to gull the public that has ever been conceived. It has been said that the pendulum experiment proves the rotation of the earth, but this is quite impossible, for one pendulum turns one way, and sometimes another pendulum turns in the opposite direction. Now we ask, does the earth rotate in opposite directions at different places at one and the same time? We should like to know. Perhaps the experimenters will kindly enlighten us on this point. If the earth had the terrible motions attributed to it, there would be some sensible effects of such motions. But we neither feel the motion, see it, nor hear it, and how people can stand watching the pendulum vibrate and think that they are seeing a proof of the motions of the earth almost passes comprehension. They are, however, brought up to believe it, and it is thought to be scientific to believe what the astronomers teach." Also in the mid-19th century, another Frenchman named Gaspard Gustave Coriolis performed several experiments showing the effect of kinetic energy on rotating systems, which have ever since become mythologized as proof of the heliocentric theory. The Coriolis effect is often said to cause sinks and toilet bowls in the northern hemisphere to drain spinning in one direction, while in the southern hemisphere causing them to spin the opposite way, thus providing proof of the spinning ball earth. Once again, however, just like Foucault's pendulums spinning either which way, sinks and toilets in the northern and southern hemisphere do not constantly spin in any one direction. Sinks and toilets in the very same household are often found to spin in opposite directions, depending entirely upon the shape of the basin and the angle of the water's entry, not the supposed rotation of the earth. Jennifer Horton wrote, "While the premise makes sense that the earth's eastward spin would cause the water in a toilet bowl to spin as well, in reality the force and speed at which the water enters and leaves the receptacle is much too great to be influenced by something as minuscule as a single 360-degree turn over the span of a day. When all is said and done, the Coriolis effect plays no larger a role in toilet flushes than it does in the revolution of CDs in your stereo. The things that really determine the direction in which water leaves your toilet or sink are the shape of the bowl and the angle at which the liquid initially enters the bowl." The Coriolis effect is also said to affect bullet trajectories and weather patterns as well, supposedly causing most storms in the northern hemisphere to rotate counterclockwise and most storms in the southern hemisphere to rotate clockwise, to cause bullets from long-range guns to tend towards the right of the target in the northern hemisphere and to the left in the southern hemisphere. Again, however, the same problems remain. Not every bullet and not every storm consistently displays the behavior, and therefore cannot reasonably be used as proof of anything. What about the precision of the sight aperture, human error, and wind? What about Michelson, Morley, and Gale's proven motion of the ether's potential effect? Why does the Coriolis effect affect most storms, but not all? If some storms rotate clockwise in the north and counterclockwise in the south, how do those storms escape the Coriolis force? And if the entire Earth's spin is uniform, why should the two hemispheres be affected any differently? Coriolis's effect and Foucault's pendulum are both said to prove the Earth moves beneath our feet, but in reality only prove how easy it can be for wolves in sheep's clothing to pull the wool over our eyes. Another supposed ball earth proof is that in the northern hemisphere, sinks, drains, toilets all spin one direction, and in the southern hemisphere they spin the other direction, and this is proof that the earth is a spinning ball once again. However, you can find, even within your own household sometimes, drains will drain in opposite directions, let alone opposite hemispheres. So there's you can see videos on YouTube of people doing this trick at the equator. They'll set up a sink and then they'll say, "This is the equator." They'll be in Ecuador or something, and then they'll have the water will go down straight.
and then they'll walk a few paces, and like, okay, now we're in the northern hemisphere, and the water will go one way, and then they'll fill it up again and go down in the southern hemisphere, do it again, it goes the other way. Everybody oohs and ahs, and they give a little tip to the demonstration and move on to their next tourist destination. What is happening is that the water will drain based on either the shape of the basin or the direction that the water is flowing in originally. So this trick is done by just when you fill the water in, you fill it so that it's already spinning in one direction before you pull the plug. And you'll just have to quickly pull the plug, otherwise it'll always look like it goes straight down.
Science with a capital S for you right there.
Exactly, yeah. So, I mean, you can test this. There's videos debunking this on YouTube. People have found drains going both directions within their own household. And so now it's just yet another lame excuse trying to prop up a dying model.